So, Paul, you are a clinical psychologist, a professor of clinical psychology with 40 years' experience in the National Health Service. Your particular specialty or specialism is the psychobiology of compassion. For those of us who are teaching in higher education, for example, myself and colleagues, what would you say to us are the reasons why we should be trying to embed compassion into our pedagogy?
Well, that's a great question, Theo, and what you're doing is fantastic. So, as you say, I worked in the health service for 40 years, and many of the people that come through needing psychological help have depression and anxiety, and we know that these are problems for students too, particularly in the high competitive environments that are being created around us at the moment. You know, there's been quite a lot of research now done on the impact of high competitive pressure on stress rates and also on learning.
Yes.
So we now know that when people are stimulated in compassion motivation, this changes the way in which the brain actually works, changes the way they think, it changes the way in which they engage in critical and explorative thinking, which is, I think, phenomenally important for our students. It also changes the way in which they relate to others, it changes their vulnerability to stress. So understanding the, as you would say, the psychobiology of compassion and linking into a lot of the research that's been done in the last 20 years, or particularly in the last 10, shows that compassion is almost a must if you're going to get the best out of your students, both in terms of their relationships and in terms of their creativity and critical thinking.
What would you say to lecturers, to tutors in higher education who say, I want to get involved with this, but this is not in my skill set?
Well, that's very important, and I think one of the, compassion has what we call facilitators and inhibitors. So facilitators are things that facilitate you in becoming compassionate and acting compassion in your environment, and facilitators are the things that block it. So there are inhibitors such as things like liking. If you like people, you're more likely to be compassionate than if you don't. And another one, as you say, is the feeling of being competent. So when people feel they are not competent in a certain kind of way, this can be an inhibitor of what they now want to do. So the most important thing is the work you're doing is showing that actually the facilitation of compassion in the learning environment is not so difficult. And we can teach this quite quickly about how, as you would say, issues of eye gaze, paying attention, voice tones, body postures, Socratic questioning, learning to ask each other questions, taking an interest in the learning of the people around you, all those things. So although it may seem like quite a complex skill set, actually it can be taught quite quickly.
I'm glad you said that. We find that too on our CPAD, our Continuing Professional Academic Development program that has been fostered for all incoming new lecturers to the University of Hertfordshire, that is very quickly and easily taught, and to students too. But then there's another criticism that comes up sometimes, and that is compassion, addressing compassion, fostering compassion is not the business of higher education.
Well, that's a wonderful question. Incidentally, if I go back to the last question, people find that when they learn these skills, they can take them into everyday life. They notice that their relationship with their friends are changing, their relationship with their partners and children are changing. So it's important for teachers to learn it for the classroom, but actually it's also personally very useful. So let me come back to this other question about it's not really the role of higher education to be purposely cultivating teachers to bring compassion into the classroom. Well, I couldn't disagree more. I think the issue that we now realize is that education without morality is dangerous. Martin Luther King pointed this out, but we also know that many of the horrors of the world have been created by educated people. They're not created by the uneducated, they're created by the educated. Educated people who lack morals are the people who build the Holocaust. So let's be absolutely clear, education without moral education is dangerous. And if we continue to have those beliefs, then there's something seriously wrong with our understanding of education.
Yes, I remember actually that there was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who pointed out that it was engineers, educated engineers, who built the gas chambers. It was qualified nurses and doctors who carried out experiments on Jewish children in the
Yeah, chemists that built the gas. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also, educated people who were behind things like the crash. I mean, there were many people in the banking industry who knew exactly what was happening. But unless we have some kind of moral code which helps us to pay attention to the suffering that we may cause by our actions, unless we take responsibility for our actions, then just being educated is not necessarily going to help us build the worlds we want to build. I mean, after all, what's the point of education? The point of education is to help people contribute to society and build a world that's better than this one. So every generation wants to build a better world, and we do that through knowledge. But if that knowledge is used to be harmful, or at least if people are callous with that knowledge, they don't care, then we have problems. So we have some universities now who ask their students, you're on an engineering course, you're on a chemistry course, in what way would you like your knowledge to contribute to humanity? How would you like what you're learning? How would you like to put what you're learning to the benefit of humanity? And I think these are really extremely important questions. Very, very important questions. So compassion not only creates an environment for critical learning, an environment for confidence, an environment that reduces stress, an environment for building pro-social relationships, but it also stimulates the development of ethical and moral thinking.
So can you imagine then a situation in which compassion, micro skills of compassion, for example, can be credit-bearing on degrees in engineering, pharmacy, psychology, the humanities, business, schools, for example?
Oh, for sure. Yes, I mean, the key point, we come back again to the point you raise, is what is education for? Now, I'm not an educationist, you would know much more about that than me, but it does seem to me that knowledge for its own sake, and science is one thing, but how knowledge is used is extremely important. And if we just use knowledge to advance ourselves, regardless of the needs or the wishes of other people, and we carry on with this selfish competitiveness, we're going to run into problems.
Thanks, Paul. One last question. In higher education today, we meet our colleagues in many different departments who are overloaded, stressed, trying their very best to support student welfare against the odds. That is not just academic staff, it's counselling staff too. What advice could you give, perhaps counselling staff and academic staff, for taking care of themselves a little in terms of self-compassion?
Well, that's very, very important. I mean, there are a couple of things. Firstly, what delights me about the work that we're doing is that many people, most people I would say, by far the majority understand this. They know perfectly well that taking a compassionate orientation to life is preferable than a self-focused competitive one, for the most part. So that's important, and particularly young people. We talk to a lot of young business people now, and they're really wanting business to compete and make goods and services and profits and so on. Of course, that's important, but not when it's going to be harmful. So that's important. So the first thing then is, if you're in an environment which you're finding very stressful, what can you do with your colleagues to try to collectively support each other? That's the first thing. The second thing is how you treat yourself, because institutions like nothing better than for individuals who carry the load to blame themselves when the load gets dropped or when things go wrong. So self-criticism, for people who are in stressful organizations, self-criticism is an absolute toxic. So we certainly find in the NHS, which is a stressful thing, that often the most conscientious people are the ones that start blaming themselves and feel bad about themselves when they can't perform at the level at which they want to perform, if they feel they're letting people down or they're not doing a good enough job. So be very careful with the issue of self-criticism. So identify the source of your stress and try as best you can to address that, but be careful how you treat yourself. Never treat yourself worse than you would your best friend.
Could you give us a couple of tips on that?
Well, there are lots of things. I mean, on the internet now, there are many, many trainings for compassionate, developing compassionate self. One is, for example, learning certain breathing practice, which will stimulate patterns of activation in your body. It's what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, although you don't need to know that, which will help you to ground yourself and slow down various bodily processes. when we're stressed and we're ruminating about all the problems we have at work and so forth, this stimulates what we call the sympathetic nervous system, and that speeds things up in the body, and then you find yourself going over and over things and worrying about things, and so you're staying in a highly stressful state, and then of course your body is getting all those stress hormones. So one of the things to do is to notice, to become mindful of what's happening in your mind, and then switch into a deliberate process of learning how to slow down by learning to breathe and learning to focus your mind on things that are going to be helpful to you. So there are a lot of different techniques for this, but the key thing is don't put yourself down, don't treat yourself any worse than you would your best friend. And the things you say to yourself, think to yourself, would I be prepared to say this to somebody I care about? You know, if you wouldn't, then don't do it, basically.
These are the voices, the self-critical voices that torment staff as well as students.
Very much
before they go to sleep at night, when they wake up in the morning and they don't even know we're doing it.
Yes, that's right. And anticipatory worry. I mean, and, you know, we have a brain that's very good at anticipatory worry. The problem is in modern society, we don't live in the savannas now so much, anticipatory worry drives us nuts. So we're always worrying about things that could happen, might happen, and so on, and 9 times out of 10 they don't. But we're left with the physiological effects of assuming that they may well happen. So we're ruminating because we're constantly anticipating, and your mind is set up, it's called negativity bias, your mind is set up to over-focus on threats.
But as you say, to perhaps change the voice, to be a kinder voice, to witness what you're saying to yourself, and to say it in a warm tone.
Yes, now that's very important, because when you explore the emotional tone of self-critical thinking, it's usually hostile or contemptuous. Okay, so one of the things to do is not just to change the content, what you say, but how you say. So learning how to have a friendly conversation with oneself is very important, and that in therapy, that is something we teach a lot about how to generate friendly voices, friendly textures to your thoughts, rather than hostile, contemptuous usage, that sort of thing.
And it's the high achieving students as well as those who are struggling that will often come into me as the academic skills teacher in my university, in the School of Humanities, and say to themselves, well, they've got very high marks, that perhaps they've forgotten to put this paragraph in, or got a reference wrong, and that they feel that they're stupid, they could kick themselves in a very nasty tone as well, and they have no idea that that is contributing to why they can't stop crying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. It's very, very important, that, because the other thing is that you see this competitive drive that's sort of come through Western society and it's driving us all crazy actually. Creates a situation where the more you want something, the more important it is to you, the more frustrated, the more angry you get if your path to it is blocked. Okay, so the more, as you say, the more intense people compete, then the more hostile they are if they start failing. Okay, so you've got to balance your values and your goals, because if you make them too intense, I have to, I got to, that intensity, then when things start to struggle, your criticism can become very hostile. We always used to say to our clients, our patients, the secret of success is the ability to fail, and that we're going to teach you to fail. And they say, oh no, you must teach me to succeed. No, because if you know how to fail, then you will succeed. It's when you don't know how to fail, that's when you get into trouble, because you can't just bounce back again and have another go, and have another go, and have another go. You're frightened of failing, and that drives you, that fear of failing. Well, what we try to stimulate is you take an enjoyment for learning, and if you fall over, well, learn from that and have another go, and have another go, because you don't have that beat-up job in your head. So as long as you're not beating up yourself, then you can be disappointed, but you feel right about you.
Thank you, Paul. So we've had, thank you so much. So we've had a look at why you think we should, in higher education, be trying to foster compassion.
Very much.
You've responded as well, thank you, to staff who may feel, academic staff who feel it's not their skill set, whereas in fact it's well within their reach and easily so. And why you would suggest that it is wrong to think that higher education should not take a role in purposely fostering compassion. and in students' fear of failure, and ours too, and how we can be self-compassionate. Thank you very much, Paul.
And this is part, I have to say, of a world movement, right? There's also, and you can go on the internet and look at this, compassion in business, ethics in business, right? Businesses are waking up, and many business people now are not just selfishly competitive. They are wanting to compete and they want to do well, of course they do, but they are really developing the idea of how do we create an ethical, moral business so that we have a society and a world where we can all benefit from the, from the wealth and creation that we create. And so education is part of that, and bringing that into education is just wonderful. What we're doing is fantastic.
I'm very glad as well to see that more and more businesses are seeing that fostering compassion actually sustains their chosen business models.
Yes, absolutely. Because you have happier staff, you have more creative staff, your staff are more loyal. If they feel they're treated with compassion, they're going to go the extra mile for you. So many, many things, right, that actually will help your business. And also many, many people like the idea of working for a moral as opposed to an immoral business. So there are lots of benefits in businesses taking up an ethical position.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much.